Anyways, welcome back. Today we're doing Chapter 5, Endogenous Growth Models and Perpetual Growth. Why are we doing this? Well, the reason we're doing this is the Neoclassical Growth Model has some issues, right? Same as the Solo Growth Model had some issues. Now, some of them are the same issues, some of them aren't the same issues. We already talked about the issues with the Solo model, and one of the issues in the Solo model is exactly the issue that we are sort of concerned about as well in the Neoclassical Growth Model, namely that technology or technology shocks are considered to be exogenous. There's a problem with this because when we try to think about this, if we try to put this into some sort of context, we very quickly begin to realize that growth really isn't exogenous. Because if growth were exogenous, we would just wake up and have all this cool new technology that we somehow miraculously already knew how to use. That's not a very feasible assumption, is it? Because we've seen throughout the course of history so far that in order to get these technology shocks, in order to get growth, right, it has to come from not necessarily outside the model, but more like inside the model. Because you're investing. Whether you're investing in physical capital or human capital, you are still making an investment. So if you're investing in physical capital, well, that's like, buying more stuff to help you produce for your firm. If you're investing in human capital, that's like going to school, getting a good college degree from an excellent school, like, I don't know, Clemson University? Yeah, probably Clemson University would be a good one to go to. But let's say you go to Clemson and you learn all this really awesome economic theory. And you're like, I want to get a PhD in economics. So you go somewhere to get a PhD. Clemson's also a good choice for that, I would know. And you go, hey, I love these macro growth models. They're really awesome. And you really get into it. So you start trying to contribute to the literature. You try to contribute to the knowledge base a little bit, right? Maybe you even develop a new way to model this stuff. Get yourself a Nobel Prize. Well, if that happens, the knowledge base in our economy is now expanded. We're doing just better overall, and there's going to be growth, right? If I go back to my guitar examples, let's say if you're Christoph Kemper and you decide to come up with the Kemper profiling amplifier, well, you kind of took the existing tube technology and improved on it in a way that made it at least a little bit more efficient to be able to produce stuff because you don't have to lug heavy amplifiers around, you don't have to spend as much to get all these different amps. You kind of technically have as many amps as you want to get stored into your profiler, and if they won't fit in the profiler, you can put them in the computer and switch them around because it does communicate with your computer, thank God. And so it's ultimately ends up being cheaper. It's more efficient, it's lighter, it's easier to carry around, so if you ever go on tour, Kemper's a great thing to go with. So overall, that's definitely some kind of a technological improvement. But that was because Christoph Kemper understood both digital modeling stuff and existing tube amp technology. And he figured out a way to get the tube amp sound into this digital modeling preamp. Well, that didn't happen by chance. That happened because he knew what the hell he was doing because he had to learn all about that stuff, right? So there was an investment that occurred there. There was a human capital investment, which we'll be getting to in the next model, but there was still investment involved. So without having the assumption that growth can come from within the model, it's probably not a very good model, right? Neoclassical growth model is an excellent model to learn. It's like sort of the workhorse model for all of these other types of models out there. And knowing how to solve it pretty much means you know how to solve any type of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. But it's not necessarily the model that gets used. So as we can see thus far, before we even get to this, we can see that we had the Solo model first, right? That was great. Kind of gave us a cool way to look at dynamic macro, and then from there we were like, well, there are some issues with this. Neoclassical growth model comes along. Holy shit, major improvement, pretty cool stuff. Right? So then we kind of took that, ran with it, but then we're like, there's some problems with this too. What are the problems? Well, exogenous growth doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. There's no real balanced growth path, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So there was kind of some issues with that. And therefore, the endogenous growth theory stuff started coming out. I believe Romer was one of the guys that helped develop it, if not the first guy to do it. He played a role in it, at least as much as I know. He played a role in it. That stuff comes along, and it gives us slightly more plausible predictions, because as I'm sure you've already seen, right, we can get pretty decent predictions out of a model, even if some of the assumptions going into the model aren't exactly perfect. But if we have imperfect assumptions, and we also have really, really inaccurate predictions, well, then that's not necessarily a good model. So we have some issues here, right? And a lot of the assumptions that may not perfectly line up when we're setting up a model, they're what's known as simplifying assumptions. It's really just a way of saying we're going to try to minimize the amount of math that we have to do, because if it's not entirely necessary to do it, then who cares? So, anyways, enough of me rambling on and on and on. Let's sort of get to the motivation of this model. So now let's assume there's an aggregate production function of the Cobb-Douglas flavor where alpha is between 0 and 1. What that implies is that this production function has constant returns to scale. Now, that's what we've learned for the solo growth model. It's what we learned for the neoclassical growth model. And, they seem like pretty decent assumptions to make and fairly, straightforward, what have you. But maybe that's not the best way to go about it, right? Because we know that firms exist to maximize their profit or minimize cost. One implies the other does not imply the other one. But let's say the firm has this production, this is their output, right? And then we can say their total costs are the nominal wage rate times the amount of labor that's used, plus the nominal interest rate times the rental rate of capital. Right, so this is the two things that we would see if we're trying to do a profit maximization problem here. Right, now, if you remember, profits are total revenue minus total cost. Total revenue is price times output. Right, so we just have price, so total revenue equals the price times our output. Like this. So profit is equal to total revenue minus our total costs. Nominal wage rate times the amount of labor we use plus real interest rate times the amount of capital that's used. This is what we get. Total revenue, total cost. All right, now when we maximize profit, we take partial derivatives, set them equal to 0, solve out from there. So, I'm going to have two first order conditions, one for capital, one for labor. I get these two first order conditions right here. Marginal product of labor. Oopsies. I made a boo-boo. Marginal product of capital times price minus, I am screwing up across the board right now. There we go. Minus the rental rate on capital. Good job, Jeremy. So what happens when you get up too early? Normally I sleep till like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Today I woke up at like, I think 8:30. So, marginal product of capital times the price minus the rental rate on capital equals 0. Marginal product of labor times price minus the nominal wage rate equals 0. Right? Well, we can basically just move these two guys to the other side, and that gives me price times the marginal product of capital equals the rental rate of capital. I can do the exact same thing for the marginal product of labor. Price times marginal product of labor. Oops. Equals the nominal wage rate. Alright, so this is what I get. Now, if I want the real interest rate and the real wage rate, well, I just divide both of these by PT. So for capital, what I get is that the marginal products are equal to their factor prices. The marginal product of capital is equal to the real interest rate. The marginal product of labor is equal to the real wage rate. Right, you've probably seen some of this stuff from intermediate or from intermediate micro before. Right, but a little bit of a problem. The marginal product is paid its factor price. Production function is constant returns to scale. So while the marginal products are paid their factor prices, which is what we expect to see in a perfectly competitive economy, there's unfortunately there's nothing left to be able to reinvest in the firm. Now, granted, this is the aggregate production function, so it's sort of like the aggregate supply side of the economy. There's no way to pay for future investment. me sad face. Right? There's no way to get additional investment when we have constant returns to scale. Alright, but what if we had increasing returns to scale? Do we think that could maybe give us something a little bit better? I'll say increasing returns to scale might be a bit better. How would we do that? Well, one way we could possibly do it could let alpha be equal to 1 or larger than 1. Right? That might make things a little bit easier. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing here. Right? We're going to allow for increasing returns to scale using the existing neoclassical growth model that we saw in the previous chapter. And, well, we're going to solve it out the exact same way that we would with the neoclassical growth model. Right? There's really only one change that we make when it comes to the neoclassical growth model in order to get an endogenous growth model. And it's going to really allow for a lot more interesting stuff to be able to happen. So, now that I have sort of motivated this, now that I've explained where some of the issues can come into play, let's get to a case where we have increasing returns to scale. So now this is section 5.3, the model. Allow me 1 second here. Okay. Sorry. Let's set the model up. Right, so as I had said before, the model's got some better assumptions than the previous models that we played with. Big assumption is, well, kind of how labor is used and how valuable labor is. Right, before we just sort of assumed that like a PhD economist, no bias here, would really have the same value as really anybody else. I don't want to take a dump on any other lines of work because they're all incredible. They're all, my brain completely died. It's probably a very bad time for my brain to die because it makes it sound like I'm trying to back off on my opinions or anything like that, which is not true. Any line of work is a good line of work, but it assumes that every single line of work is in fact the same in terms of how it contributes value to the economy. Not a very good assumption to make, right? It assumes the skill set of a PhD economist, or the values, or the value that can be contributed to society owned by someone with the skill set of a PhD economist would be the exact same as what somebody could contribute bagging groceries at a grocery store. Nothing against bagging groceries at a grocery store. It's just, well, one takes a little bit more training and with good reason. So really it's not very plausible to assume that every profession is the same, right? But let's look at a production function where we have something along the lines of this. Now this is per capita. Rather than aggregate, so I've already converted this, right? I've already put this in per capita terms for you, so you don't have to do any of those computations yourself. Right? Now this alpha is like what we've seen before, but we've also added this guy, eta. Right? Let me write it a little bit bigger just so we can all see what it is. It's like an N with like a nice little swoopy, like inverse J thing at the bottom of it. Greek letter. Cool letter. Looks cool. I like it. Right, so that's what we have. This is our production function. Now we'll be solving out the centralized solution to the model because, well, it's easier. So we're not doing a decentralized thing here. Right, now we can think of eta as a measure of human capital spillovers. Right, what do I mean by human capital? Well, knowledge. Spillovers of knowledge, say, from one part of an economy or one sector of an economy to another. Now, this can account for endogenous growth and total factor productivity because there can now be spillovers of investment and output. Right, so instead of just making alpha itself larger than 1, what we're doing is we're adding another term into this exponent, which means that capital's share of income, alpha, doesn't necessarily have to change. It's just that we're specifying some other aspects of production that the Neoclassical Growth Model may not have been able to actually pick up. Therefore, the Neoclassical Growth Model may very well be misspecified. Now, everything else is going to be the same. Utility is the same. All right, so we still have log utility over an infinite horizon with exponential discounting. Right, so that's stuff that we've seen before. Good. Awesome. Right, the constraints, with the exception of production, are still identical. And just to make the point, I will do this in a different color. Show what is different. So that's what we get. All right, so we have this objective function, these three constraints. And again, we can substitute these last two constraints into the resource constraint, right? And we have the constraint in terms of capital. So we're going to combine the constraints. this. Right? Now we can just solve for C. Like that. This is what we get. Now, all we do is just set this up exactly the same way we set up the Neoclassical Growth Model. We set up our Bellman equation, we take the derivatives, get what we need, boom, bada bing, bada boom, we're done. So let's do that. I'm just going to erase this stuff over here. So we have our Bellman equation. V of kt equals the natural log of consumption, but consumption is also equal to this, so I'll just throw that in there instead. Also erase this junk. Just finish it up like that. So there's our Bellman equation. All right. Now, if you look at this and compare this to what we saw with the Neoclassical Growth Model, it's really no different. Right? The only difference we see is the addition of that eta into the exponent of capital in the production function, right? Where eta accounts for human capital spillovers, knowledge spillovers. So we just take some partial derivatives. First, we do it with respect to kt plus 1. Now, because this is equal to c, remember, just to kind of save some space here, once I take the derivative of this, I'm just substituting ct back in. Right, now I'm doing the chain rule to get the derivative of the inside. Remember, we got the natural log of this stuff's equal to c. So the derivative of the natural log of this stuff is 1 over this stuff, but this is also equal to c, right? So, first part is just 1 over ct. Now I need the derivative of the inside. This is the derivative of the outside. I got to multiply it by the derivative of the inside. So what's the derivative of the inside of this with respect to kt plus 1? Well, it's just -1. And then plus beta times the partial v of kt plus 1 with respect to kt plus 1, we set that equal to 0. Right, so this first order condition ultimately, so far, looks no different than what we saw with the Neoclassical Growth Model. Not too bad. But remember, we got to do this dv of kt with respect to kt to be able to figure out what this is. Right, so again, the partial of this, only now it's with respect to kt. But the inside is still the same. We're just taking a derivative with respect to a different argument inside. So it's still 1 over all this junk, which comes out to 1 over ct, but now we have to take the derivative of this thing with respect to kt not kt plus 1. And that gives me alpha plus eta times at times kt to the alpha plus eta minus 1. Right? Minus kt plus 1, well, that differentiates to 0. That's not kt. This kt here, though, that differentiates to just 1 minus delta. Booyah. Right? So we're almost done. We just have to update that thing one period. How do we update this one period? Well, I just add 1 to all the t subscripts. So get this. And then all I do is, because this dvkt plus 1 dkt plus 1 is equal to this, and this shows up here, but it also shows up here, I can take this and just plug it in here. And what that will give me is the following. I'm going to rewrite this first order condition. As such. I get that. Right, and then I just move this 1 over ct to the other side, and that gives me made another mistake here. And we catch the mistake Jeremy made. That's the mistake Jeremy made. It's supposed to be times 1 over ct plus 1. Hopefully nobody caught that, so I didn't confuse anyone. Right, because if that's equal to this, then when I plug that in, I should be getting this. So it's beta times alpha plus eta, at plus 1, kt plus 1 to the alpha plus eta minus 1, plus 1 minus delta. Close out these parentheses and multiply that by 1 over ct plus 1. This is our Euler equation. Right, now this Euler equation really isn't all that different from what we saw with the Neoclassical Growth Model. So I'm going to erase this stuff, move this over to this side so we can have a little bit more board space to talk about what the implications are of this result. we get this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply both sides by CT plus 1. So I've got the marginal rate of substitution of current and future consumption on the left-hand side. And I have the marginal product of capital less depreciation times beta on the right-hand side. Right, so if you remember the stuff from intermediate micro, when the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the price ratio, right, that's when the agent is optimizing. Well, it's essentially what we're getting here. Right? Let me show you what I mean. This is the marginal rate of substitution. The price ratio, beta times this alpha plus eta, times AT plus 1, KAT plus 1 to the alpha plus eta minus 1 plus 1 minus delta, like that. Marginal rate of substitution, price ratio. Right? Price ratio, because we can sort of think of that as like the marginal cost of foregone consumption. Right? If I want to consume more today, what am I going to have to give up? Well, I'm going to have to give up this right here, which is equal to the real interest rate. Beta times the real interest rate would reflect the price ratio. Now, from here, this is where the interesting stuff happens to show up. Because really what we've done so far is we've just sort of solved out the neoclassical growth model with an extra term in the production function. So yeah, I probably could have just been like, here's the Euler equation with that extra term, but it probably gives us all a little bit of extra practice to be able to set up the Bellman equation, solve it out. Right, now we originally had constant returns to scale in the neoclassical growth model, but now we have increasing returns to scale, because this is not the neoclassical growth model. This is an endogenous growth model. If we had let's say neoclassical's Euler equation, use a different color marker for this. We had the neoclassical growth model's Euler equation. What we would see is this. Without any knowledge or human capital spillovers showing up in the model. So, if we don't have any knowledge or human capital spillovers showing up in the model, then, well, we kind of have a little bit of a problem for ourselves, because it would imply that the only real source of growth would come from a sub t. right, which was assumed to be exogenous. Meaning it came from outside the model, meaning that essentially it just sort of happened because we got lucky. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't really sound like the best way to go about things. Because, well, there's no way for any sort of either physical or human capital investment to show up in the model in a way that it actually can cause growth. But we can look everywhere and see that there are constantly new inventions, new innovations, new developments in human capital and also physical capital that are encouraging economic growth. Now, some might be a little bit better than others. And we'll get to what I mean by that in just a second, where ultimately some of these technological innovations are more useful. They're picked up by other industries. And there are some cases where they're not really picked up by any industries. Right? I can definitely think of a couple examples of that, which we'll be getting to in just a moment, like I said. Right? So, now, let me actually just write this. So, the only source of growth is from A. Alright, we only get that from A, which just doesn't really make any sense, right? If any of you are Star Trek fans, you've seen Star Trek First Contact, one of my favorite Star Trek movies, although I'll admit it's not exactly the most Star Trek of Star Trek movies, and it's sort of a betrayal of Picard's character, but I'm getting on a rant here. Excuse me. Ugh. I have no idea what happened. Jeez. I'm okay. I'm not dying. And it's not COVID either. Don't worry. I've already had it. So, and it wasn't fun. Well, we only grow if we get lucky, but jeez. If you've seen Star Trek First Contact, right, Zephram Cochrane didn't just go, oh, hey, you know what? I have this warp drive engine now. No, he spent a very long time developing it. God, it's like I got something stuck in my throat, and it's like, I don't know why I'm complaining about this to you guys. You're not even seeing this in real time. Whatever. Zephram Cochrane didn't just stumble upon this thing, right? It didn't just show up to him. He had to do research. He had to learn. He had to invest in his human capital in order to be able to build the warp drive engine. Once he did, makes the first warp flight. We make first contact with the Vulcans, live long and prosper. You know, the little pointy-eared guys with like the weird eyebrows have like no emotion whatsoever. Probably not very fun at a party, but they do have all sorts of cool technology that we didn't have, that, you know, we sort of collaborate with them, we develop our own stuff, but that was all because Zephram Cochrane developed the warp drive. Now, according to the Neoclassical Growth Model, the invention of the warp drive basically just happens because Zephram Cochrane wakes up one day with a warp drive bestowed upon him and full knowledge of how to use it. Doesn't really make a lot of sense to me either. So, with the Neoclassical Growth Model, well, like I said, an initial assumption, which was initially considered to be a simplifying assumption, actually kind of led to some bizarre results that just didn't make a lot of sense to us. So, we needed to change some of the initial assumptions. And that's kind of what we got here. Because instead of just alpha times at plus 1 times kt plus 1 to the alpha minus 1 plus 1 minus delta, now we have alpha plus eta times at plus 1 times kt plus 1 to the alpha plus eta minus 1 plus 1 minus delta. as this marginal product of capital. And by doing that, we have endogenized growth because we're now allowing for human capital spillovers to occur within the model, assuming that there is a form of increasing returns to scale, well, the possibility of increasing returns to scale, because there's really three cases that we're going to need to look at here to really understand what's going on. But we have now endogenized growth to some extent. So like I said, there's three cases. And these three cases really depend on what this alpha plus eta are equal to. The first case, well, actually, before I do that, there's a better way to express this whole guy, right? So let's see what's going on here. First, we're going to set this equal to gamma sub c. Right, and what this is going to do is, well, if beta times the marginal product of capital, that allows for human capital spillovers, less depreciation, is equal to gamma c, right? What that gamma c is basically going to be telling us is it's the dynamic path of the economy defined by the Euler Equation. And so by just looking at gamma c rather than all this crap, might be a little bit easier to sort of understand here. Right, so now we can talk about our three cases. My apologies for getting a little ahead of myself here. So, three cases. Let's talk about case one. All right, well, in this case, if gamma sub c is less than 1, what are we going to end up with here? Well, what we end up with is a growth process the growth process where beta times the marginal product of capital is less than 1. All right, now if we were to be looking at this thing in a steady state, remember, CT plus 1 and CT would be equal. That should just mean 1, right? When you try to put this in the steady state as well. But if gamma sub c is less than 1, well, that's a little different, isn't it? What we get that this would imply that alpha plus 8 is less than 1. So what does this give us? Well, what this gives us is that the effect of human capital spillovers eta aren't large enough to counteract the effect of this alpha minus 1 decreasing returns at the margin to individual capital accumulation. What the hell does that mean? Well, what it means is that basically we end up with something similar to the solo growth model or the neoclassical growth model. I'm going to say ends up as neoclassical growth. So it would eventually just give us the same result as the neoclassical growth model. There's no technological progress that comes from within the model that is endogenous, right? It would only be exogenous growth. So what would happen is, let's say we invested more. And KT plus 1 were to increase, right? And that's what happens when we invest. We buy more capital. Well, if KT plus 1 were to increase through investment, let's say it does so above steady state capital. Well, we get what we see in the neoclassical growth model and in the solo growth model. Growth rate of the economy goes negative. And it returns to the original steady state. If you remember the solo growth model, right, where there was like the output curve and there was investment and then there was the depreciation, right? We were to increase KT plus, or again, in that case, KT plus 1. If we were to increase KT plus 1, output would increase, right? But we were actually investing more than what was considered like the optimal, the steady state value. And so we would begin to consume more and invest less, and we sort of staircased back down to where steady state capital was. So basically, there's no progress through investment. Right? If we were to invest more, there would be no technological progress to be gained from doing so. Right? And we can really think of a lot of examples that would sort of fall within the scope of this type of situation that we would find ourselves in. Because, sure, you can think of some invention that never really took off, right? That didn't have human capital spillovers, or we can say like knowledge or technology spillovers that, story time, Jeremy, I'm gonna sit down while I talk. Make sure that I'm far enough to the side, there we go. So we didn't have any sort of technology or human capital spillovers that made it worthwhile to take that technology and invest it into other industries, right? Best example I could think of off the top of my head, and of course not by reading my notes or the book or anything like that, because, you know, I only wrote the damn things. The shake weight, right? The shake weight is not exactly a particularly useful tool, we can say. Hopefully you guys remember the shake weight. It was that like, looked like a dumbbell, and it had like a weight thing on like the inside, so like you would like shake it really hard or something, and somehow it was supposed to give you like amazingly huge biceps. Like, just, I don't know, going to the gym and lifting weights won't just do that for you. It's kind of a dumb invention. And so it really didn't have much use. Nobody really cared for it except to be able to make fun of it. Trey Parker and Matt Stone. Thanks, guys. That was an excellent South Park episode. But other than that, it didn't really generate knowledge, technology, human capital spillovers into other industries, other sectors of the economy. Nobody wanted it. They're like, what the hell am I going to do with a shake weight? Right? Besides make fun of it on South Park. So, I guess technically it had a little bit of a spillover because it did find its way into the entertainment industry as a joke for a little while. But beyond that, into anything serious that actually matters, no, it didn't. So, in that case, right, if we were to invest, we invested in the shake weight, well, it doesn't have any spillovers into other parts of the economy, so it just kind of just pitter-patters out, and it doesn't find use anywhere else. Therefore, if we were to invest in that, right, we were to get more capital for that, well, it's not spreading throughout the entire economy. It's really just staying in like one sector. It's not really going anywhere. It's not really triggering any real innovation, any real growth. So if we were to invest in more capital to produce those things, well, eventually we would see that the growth rate of the economy goes negative until it returns back to its original steady state values for capital, output, consumption, investment, etc. Right? So there's no progress that gets triggered there. And that's for the case where gamma sub c, or this whole thing right here, is less than 1, which implies alpha plus eta are less than 1. But there's two more cases. I'm pretty sure you can figure out what the two other cases are now. Right, so we're going to go to case 2, where instead of this thing being less than 1, it's going to be greater than 1. And because I'm lazy, I'm going to make a couple of changes. I'll just have to erase all this here. Sorry, guys. No, don't erase this now! They are never seen or heard from again. Here we go. So now we have case 2. Right, well now this thing is greater than 1. Well, here what we get is a growth process where beta times the marginal product of capital is greater than 1, which implies alpha plus eta is larger than 1. Learning spillovers in this case, right? Knowledge, human capital spillovers, whatever you want to call them, knowledge spillovers, eta, are sufficient to offset the diminishing marginal product of capital. So we can sort of think of this as like a learning externality. These learning externalities are so strong they're so strong that it actually forces the economy into an ever-increasing growth rate. Now, there's still a unique steady state for capital. There's a unique steady state, but it's not a stable unique steady state. It's not stable. Because gamma c is an increasing function of capital. Right, in mathy terms, means that derivative, we took the derivative of this with respect to kt plus 1, it would be positive. Remember, when the derivative is positive, right, it's increasing. The slope is increasing. The slope is positive. So if investment were to increase, which implies that you buy more kt plus 1, would just keep increasing. Right? This is a form of like explosive growth. Basically, an idea from one industry gets picked up by another industry, gets used in that industry, I'll call it the second industry. Which then gets picked up by another. ultimately what happens in this case is that, well, we get explosive growth because one invention that shows up in one sector of the economy is so badass and so awesome that other industries are like, yo, you seeing that? Like, you seeing that shit over there? That shit's fucking awesome. I want some of that shit. Right? Now, I'm not saying like they're stealing patents or anything like that, right? It would be something like, actually, there technically aren't patents in this model, so I guess there really wouldn't be anything for them to steal, right? But, you know, let's talk about the computer chip, right? The computer chip gets invented, the microprocessor, and, okay, awesome. Well, it gets used pretty much everywhere now, doesn't it? I mean, you'd be kind of hard-pressed to spend even one day without being in the presence of a computer chip. Because, well, you know, they develop this thing, computers start being pretty awesome, people use computers for all sorts of cool stuff. Right? You know, as economists, we love to do it for statistics and econometrics. We're also rather fond of using it for, you know, solving up models like this stuff here. So that's one place where it gets picked up. But, you know, it gets picked up for, like, cell phones because, you know, this thing is a pretty powerful computer. All right? Desktop computers, laptop computers, TVs have them now, right? Guitar amplification technology has them now. My Kemper has a rather large processor in it, or not really large, rather powerful processor inside of it, right? It's used in everything now. If you have a Fitbit, there you go, right? It gets picked up in so many different industries, right? It's picked up in the automotive industry, guitar industry, right? Keyboards, like, you know, playing fancy, you know, keyboard music, make it sound like it's 80s, right? It's picked up in that. So the music industry gets it. The recording industry definitely gets it. It's not like we ever record on tape anymore, thank God. Oh, God, it would be so expensive to try to record if we did it on tape. But anyways, right, it gets used in the music industry. It's used in the communications industry, obviously. It's used in, I believe I said the automotive industry, communications, just everywhere. It's used in the restaurant industry now. Like, you can go to a restaurant, sit down at the table, and order your entire meal from a tiny little computer that's a little bit bigger than your cell phone. That's just sitting at the table. You can just punch stuff in, and the server will bring it to you, right? So that computer chip gets picked up by so many industries that it just keeps expanding. Its influence is massive, right? That would mean that this eta, right, these learning spillovers, these learning externalities, are so large that while we should have a diminishing marginal product of capital, right, the spillover is so big that we actually don't have a diminishing marginal product of capital because we're adding eta to this, which makes it huge, makes it really, really big. Therefore, we end up in a situation where we have explosive growth because each industry, as every industry starts to incorporate this, well, people are like, oh, wow, okay, cool. There's kind of something to be had here. I want to invest in that crap, right? So they'll invest in that. And, you know, booming industries come up and you get explosive growth. So that would be the case where this thing is larger than 1. Let's see. So basically, just to sort of wrap this up, just reading directly off my notes now, we invest more in each industry that experiences these spillovers because it's paying off even more and more than it was earlier. So the more we invest, the more it grows, and because more and more people find more and more uses for it, well, the return on that investment keeps going up, hence explosive growth. Right? So in this case, we don't have a stable, steady state for capital or output because as soon as we begin investment, right, that steady state capital just keeps increasing. So it's not stable, right? It's not like a stationary value for capital because it's going to keep increasing. We're going to keep investing because the payoffs from investment will keep increasing, right? So that's the case where alpha plus eta is larger than 1, right? Which leads us to our final case. What did I do over here? So, case 3. But you know what it is now. Oh, shit. Whatever. Let's rewrite the whole damn thing. So of our 3 cases, we've discussed the first one, gamma c was less than 1, which implies alpha plus eta is less than 1. Learning spillovers aren't large enough to offset the diminishing marginal product of capital. Right, so we basically end up in a situation very similar to the solo or neoclassical growth model. Case 2. Gamma c larger than 1. Implies alpha plus eta is also larger than 1. In this case, learning spillovers are sufficient. They're incredibly sufficient to offset the diminishing marginal product of capital, so much so that as soon as we begin investing in something, we develop, like, say, the computer chip, we end up seeing explosive economic growth. Because what's happening is more and more industries are picking up on this stuff. And because more industries are picking up on this stuff, well, they're going like, this is kind of cool. Like, I really like this thing. This is interesting. This is neat. And so they incorporate it into their industry. People go, oh, wow, okay, cool. This industry is expanding. I am going to invest in this industry because there's obviously going to be a huge payoff in investing in that industry. And it just sort of filters through, and all these industries pick it up. Case 3 is the last case. Gamma c is equal to 1. So what that tells me, that beta times the marginal product of capital is equal to 1, which therefore implies alpha plus eta is equal to 1. In this case, learning externalities exactly offset the diminishing marginal product of capital. Now this reduces to what's known in the growth literature the AK model. In the AK model, what we get is y is equal to a times k. That's the production function, right? So the exponent on k is equal to 1. Right, so if the exponent on k, with the inclusion of not just the capital share of output, alpha, but also learning externalities, in the case where they're less than 1, that exponent on k there would be less than 1. In the case where they're larger than 1, the exponent on k is larger than 1. In the case where they're equal to 1, which means on the margin, alpha plus eta is equal to 1, right? Meaning that any investment will generate diminishing marginal products of capital, right? It does in all three cases. But the learning externalities, instead of being so huge that it triggers like just this massive ever-increasing growth, instead what we get is more like balanced growth. So in the long run, in this case, we have a model we have a model with substitutable factors and full market clearing. So as capital increases, output increases, right? Which we would, expect. But remember, this is per capita. All right, this is the per capita marginal products of capital. All right, so this is per person. It's like individual investment. It's not a good day for my asthma. So as capital increases, output increases, as we would always expect it to, right? But not quite just like that. It increases in proportion. And we would still have full employment. I'll say full employment of labor. And there is substitutability within the production function. In this case, any sort of new ideas these new ideas generate knowledge spillovers by like just the right amount. They don't do it too much, they don't do it too little. So an increase in savings, thus investment, say increases in investment, so increases in investment will permanently increase the growth rate, and output per person will grow at a positive rate. Right, so even in this case, some new idea comes in, generates a spillover, everybody's made better off. Right, but we don't get like this explosive growth process. Instead, we get what's known as a balanced growth path. Now, under the balanced growth path, what this is basically assuming is that, yes, technically there's still a steady state. But within that steady state, remember before in the steady state, the only thing that could trigger growth was that exogenous shock. Right now, basically, technology shocks or knowledge spillovers, eta, can allow for growth to occur within the model, and when it perfectly offsets capital's share of output, we end up on what's known as a balanced growth path. Therefore, we have endogenized growth within this particular model, right? Because growth can now come from inside the model. Because if we decide to invest more, and we were to gain knowledge from investing, right? So you go to school and you learn computer science, computer engineering, something like that, right? Well, you're going to get skills that then let you go to, some company, come up with some really awesome new something or other for the computer, and that gets picked up in the computer industry, and then, it would spread throughout, but it's not necessarily one that triggers like this explosive growth where ultimately we kind of end up in like a Terminator-esque scenario where the technology basically just runs away. It's not exactly what happens with the ever-increasing growth, so don't think I'm saying that. It was just kind of a dumb joke there. The innovation here is still incredibly beneficial to the economy. Savings rates will shift to keep us on a growth path rather than seeing explosive growth, right? So here, this is the one that kind of probably makes the most sense, right? This innovation gets picked up by a bunch of other industries, and people will begin investing more in these other industries, right? But it's not like you invest more, you keep getting more back. The more you invest, the more you get back. The more you invest, the more you get back, right? That's kind of what people thought was happening, like with the housing bubble and the events between, I think it was like 2002, 2003, up to 2008. Right? It's like, oh man, the housing market's booming, right? The more you buy, the more you invest, the more you're going to make. It's going to be awesome. It's totally can't ever go wrong, can it? No, definitely not. Right here we get more balanced growth. The savings rates will shift to make sure that rather than just explosively increasing, right, we just kind of stay along this nice balanced growth path. And this balanced growth path is experiencing growth because of these knowledge spillovers. And in this case, the growth rate of capital per worker is the growth rate of income per capita. Yeah. So So the growth rate of capital per worker, right? The rate of change of this lowercase k. Excuse me. And it's equal to the growth rate of per capita income. Now, while I talked about the computer chip with like the explosive growth case, right, it's probably a little bit more likely that what's actually happening here, let me see. Just want to make sure I'm not missing it. Okay, cool. Not missing anything. Excellent. Sorry, I had to check my email for something rather important. While the computer chip example was kind of using the explosive growth case, it's probably a better example to use here, right? The explosive growth case isn't exactly the best one because it's like unstable. It's an unstable growth path that we're on, right? That unique steady state for capital that I was talking about, not having a stable steady state, meaning as soon as we began to invest, we just keep going and going and going and going and going. Not really the best outcome. The best outcome is this nice balanced growth path, and that's what we've seen. All right, so that's what we see when it comes to like cutting edge growth, is this balanced growth path. We develop the computer chip, it gets picked up by other industries, we can begin investing in them. Eventually the savings rates will kind of change and sort of help offset some of this stuff, basically meaning investment will sort of eventually taper off, and it keeps us on this balanced growth path, right? And so as far as like solving the model out analytically and thinking about each case, each situation for the model, well, we're pretty much done. But now what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at shocks to this model, and we're going to be doing it with pictures rather than just me going like, oh, here's a shock to AT and a shock to AT plus 1, right? We're doing it with pictures this time. So when we look at shocks, right, we have really a couple. There's a couple cases that I have in these notes here that I'm looking at. We have anticipated and unanticipated shocks. Now the book goes through a number of these shocks, and I am going to explain the basics for some of these shocks, and then maybe give an example or two. All right, so now that we have our steady states, we want to really think about these transitional dynamics, right? How do the dynamics of this economy transition when there are shocks, right? When there are changes to stuff within the model. So we're putting the model into like a dynamic general equilibrium. So you can list out all of our general equilibrium equations, right? We disturb the equilibrium a bit and want to see how it responds. So it's really the same idea as like what you did in micro when you had supply and demand, right? There was a shock to either supply or a shock to demand, and it shifted either supply or demand in one direction or the other, and you wanted to see how the system, how the economy, or at least how that particular market responded. Well, it's basically what we're doing here. We're doing actually the exact same thing. But there are two kinds of shocks that we're going to be looking at. This is section 5.5. We've got two types of shocks. There are anticipated shocks. unanticipated shocks, thus being the second that we're going to be looking at. Right, so if we're thinking about a change in price, right, it all depends on whether or not we saw this shock coming, whether the shock was anticipated, so to speak. Right, if the shock's anticipated, people can prepare for it, right, they get ready for it, the price doesn't jump as much. Right, if you see, let's say, a hurricane coming, right, if a hurricane is about to hit, and let's say you have, I don't know, a week to be able to evacuate. Well, okay, cool, right? Granted, maybe not the best example in the world, because you still kind of have to hurry and rush to get out, right? But you'll get out, you'll make it out alive. Maybe you'll sit in traffic for like 30-something hours trying to get out as everybody's evacuating, but you can prepare for that shock, right? A type of natural disaster you may not be able to prepare for at all would be either like an earthquake or a tornado, something like that, right? Something that just, boom, pops up out of the blue. You're like, holy shit, where did that come from, right? Difference between anticipated and unanticipated shocks, right? Well, the same thing sort of happens when it comes to growth and development in economics, right? Now, we're going to have to remember that supply is fixed in the short run. Right, so we'll just go ahead and say supply is fixed in the short run, right? Think housing, right? If there's an increase in demand for housing, well, they're not going to be able to just magically get new houses to appear out of the blue. No, right? There would be an increase in the price for housing because there is an increase in demand for housing. So when there's an increase in demand for housing, the price goes up. The increase in that price is a signal to producers that they can make more if they built more houses. So they build more houses, and as the supply increases, the price begins to taper off. So you would see price spike at the beginning, sends that signal to producers, they need to make more houses, and then the price level begins to reduce again. Right? So in that case, yeah, the quantity can't immediately respond. So what we would see is sort of like a vertical supply curve at first, but as more and more houses get built and the quantity of houses goes up, right, we would see the supply curve become a little bit more just like upward sloping. Right? So is this basically what we would see is first, well, let me draw this out. So I'll do for an unanticipated shock. What we would get is something that looks like this. And if there is an unanticipated demand shock, this unanticipated demand shock shifts that demand curve out like that. Now, this shock, like I said, wasn't anticipated, so supply didn't have a chance to sort of prepare for this shock that was like oncoming, right? It was just boom, all of a sudden we want a bunch of this stuff, right? Housing markets. If more people want to buy houses and it just happens totally out of the blue, well, there aren't really any more houses to buy. I mean, yeah, there are some houses on the market, but there aren't new houses, right? But what can happen, though, is as we get more suppliers that are willing to produce and able to produce, they build more houses because they see that increase in price as a signal And as that price goes up, they see that signal to make more stuff, then the supply will shift. So when supply shifts in response to this unanticipated demand shock, I'll put it here. Initially what happens, the price level increases from P0, we'll say, up to P1. Right, that's when the demand shock hits. But as suppliers begin to make more stuff, where we were initially at output level Y0, we go to output level Y1. So the price initially goes up as there's this unanticipated shock. As suppliers produce more, output goes up, the price eventually falls. Right, but that's the unanticipated scenario. Right, let's talk about the anticipated scenario. So for the anticipated shocks, in this case, suppliers see it coming. So what we get is before, right, where demand shifted out along this fixed supply curve, Alright, so the initial setup is the same. Only now, because this is anticipated, suppliers see it coming. Well, supply increases to accommodate this expected increase in demand. Therefore, initially, the price level drops. Right, so if suppliers knew there was going to be this increase in demand for housing, they would be like, all right, we're going to make more. and the price drops. And then as that sort of incoming demand shock enters in, then demand will shift out. So once that demand shock actually occurs, like that, then the price level will go up. And again, output increased. So we kind of get the same set of results at the end, right? Now, depending on what the magnitude of these shocks are going to be, the way you want to draw it, it's going to give us totally different, like, magnitudes of responses with, regard to the change in price and output and stuff like that. Because again, we're drawing pictures. We're not playing with numbers. We're just drawing pictures right now. But here, right, what we saw was the price level drop and then eventually increase again. Now, it may increase above the initial price, it may not, right? It all depends on how you draw the picture. So let's sort of recap what the ordering of events would be here for the anticipated versus unanticipated shocks. All right, so for unanticipated, demand moves first. So no immediate change. To output. The prices increase. Supply goes up, meaning output goes up, prices go down. So we could say we would get that. Price goes up, sends that signal to suppliers, output goes up, price level goes down again. For the anticipated shock, supply moves first. To accommodate the expected demand increase. So output increases and the price level falls. Then the incoming demand shock hits and the price level goes up. So in this case, output goes up, which drives the price down. Demand shock hits, price goes back up. All right, so just looking at these two here, we can see the ordering is different. The order of the responses is different. So we can sort of say that we can identify the differences between an anticipated and unanticipated shock. So with that out of the way, as far as how to draw this, let's talk about some examples of some of these shocks. Now I'm going to go over a couple of them right now during story time with Jeremy. I have no idea if it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood or not because, well, my blinds are closed and they're doing all sorts of construction outside still. Construction that was supposed to be done 3 weeks ago. And well, anyways, let's talk about let's see, what do I want to talk about first? Okay, let's talk about the baby boom. Baby boom in education. All right, well, after World War II, back to story time with Jeremy, you see kids, after World War II, when these soldiers came home, let's say that they, they really missed their wives, a lot. They missed them a lot. In fact, they missed them so much, they made a lot of new babies. There were a ton of new babies coming out. And so while they were celebrating not being at war and having to kill people anymore, they were able to stay at home and make babies with their wives, have a lot of fun making babies. Now, when that happened, there's a huge increase in birth rates. Right? Fertility rates soared. Now, cool. Let's think about what that would imply for the need for education. Well, as there's this baby boom, as fertility rates increase, there's going to be an increased need for education. And schools saw that. They saw that coming, right? Because as soon as the kid has to enter school, right, legally speaking, it's either kindergarten or first grade. I think then it was just first grade when you were legally required to enter school. I think now it might be kindergarten, maybe varies by state. I don't know. I have no idea how it works. I don't have kids. I have cats. Sometimes they're easier to deal with, sometimes they're not. But regardless, at some point, you're legally required to enter school. And so the schools, let's say it's kindergarten, right? So we have a nice round 5 years, because you're usually 5 when you enter kindergarten. At least I think you are. Yeah, I think you're 5 when you start. So these schools go, okay, well, we've got 5 years to prepare for this massive influx of new kids. So they start building new schools. They start adding to the existing schools. Right? I'm sure your elementary, high school, middle school, whatever. If you were as fortunate as I was, where I went to Richmond Hill, which is just outside of Savannah, Georgia. Well, there's this massive influx of students, and I don't know if they couldn't afford or didn't have time or whatever to build new classrooms and just as an additional attachment to the building. They said, screw it, just brought a bunch of these trailers in. So half the classes I took were inside these trailers, right? But that was sort of in this case, it would be an anticipated shock. They saw a lot of new kids coming in, so they built new schools, they added on to the new schools, they had to build new desks, hire new teachers, etc. Therefore, the supply increases, right? But the demand is still the same at first, because they have 5 years to prepare for that demand shock of when the kids actually just storm the school, right? So the demand then shifts as these kids storm the school. They're like, oh, we want to learn. Actually, they probably weren't doing that. They're probably like, Mom, don't leave me here. I don't want to go to school. This is scary. I miss you guys. Not like I was that kid or anything. They had time to prepare for that shock, right? So that would be an anticipated shock. In which case, the supply shifts first, demand shifts second. Right? Let's see, what's another unanticipated shock? All right, as we did the anticipated cover already, or the anticipated shock, let's cover an unanticipated one. Which one would I like to do? Well, I guess for the interest of saving time in the storytelling with Jeremy, because I don't want this lecture to run too much longer. And, you still kind of need to be able to read some of the stuff on your own as well. let's talk about the baby bust. Right, so soldiers came home, they were happy, they missed their wives, they really missed their wives really missed their husbands, and the result was a lot of babies. So many babies, you'll have so many babies. Power thirst. And it was probably a reference to a video that none of you have seen, and I will just look like a giant loser. But anyways, eventually fertility rates dropped, they tapered off, right? You aren't seeing fertility rates anywhere near as high as what they were then. Right? Back then, I mean, these families had 4, 5, 6 kids, and that was not, like, uncommon. My mother grew up in a household of 4 kids. My dad grew up in a household of 3. And so, yeah, that was pretty large number of children. Right now, most households will have 1 or 2 children, right? Maybe 3, maybe 3. But for the most part, households generally have 1 or 2 kids now. But back then, yeah, 4, 5, 6 kids, totally not uncommon at all. So when that baby boom first took place, yeah, that was an anticipated shock. But people stopped having kids, or at least at the same rate that they were before. Right? Because both of my parents were baby boomers. And so while they saw the shock coming in for the baby boom, right, the baby bust, this reduction in fertility rates, wasn't seen coming. And it was just this massive decline in fertility rates around the mid-1960s. There was a negative demand shock for schooling that people didn't really see coming. There were a lot of teachers that were left with smaller classes. Right, so initially, the classes might have been 30, 35 students. They reduced down to, say, 20 or 25 students, right? As fertility rates fell, there'd be fewer children being made, and fewer children being made means, well, negative demand shock for schooling, right? There aren't as many kids that need to be educated anymore, so class sizes fall. And so teachers get smaller classes, if they're lucky, and if they're unlucky, they lose their jobs. That's not very good, right? But this didn't just extend to like schooling stuff, right? It actually extended through most of the economy, and the annual current population survey, or CPS, data shows that earnings actually took a pretty large hit after the baby bust. Now, I mean, there were other things going on at that time as well that can account for teachers losing their jobs, right? So it wasn't like we can just only blame this on the baby bust. Now, there were multiple shocks that were occurring at that point in time that would explain a reduction in the employment of teachers, but that is one of the things that led to the reduction in teacher employment. And so with that, I'm sure this lecture went pretty long, probably about an hour and 45 minutes, maybe close to 2 hours. So there will be another model that we cover after this, but for the most part, this covers the first lecture and a half that's needed for this week. So there's going to be a little bit more of a lecture with another model that comes for the end of this week and next week. And we will be done with growth and development entirely. And it will then just be time to, take an exam. So in the meantime, enjoy this stuff. Work through, if you're still having a problem with like the Bellman equation stuff, well, just work through the Neoclassical Growth Model and now the Endogenous Growth Model with Perpetual Growth. And see if it happens to just make a little bit more sense to you. Another cool thing to do is compare the steady states of the Solo Growth Model, Neoclassical Growth Model, and then try to find the steady states for the Endogenous Growth Model with Perpetual Growth. I'm going to give you a hint. It's the exact same stuff you got to do for the Neoclassical Growth Model. Nothing's that different. And that will terminate this lecture. So until next time, bye-bye.